By the time the first civilian arc split open against the failing transfer lattice, Minister Selvarin had already signed the evacuation order she had sworn she would never sign. The command glass in front of her was thick enough to stop shrapnel, vacuum surge, and 3 classes of boarding fire, but it could not keep out the sound. Even through layers of shielding, she heard the corridor die. Not the explosion itself, not the metal tearing, but the change that followed it. The sudden collapse of disciplined command traffic into overlapping screams, clipped status calls, and the raw, ugly breathing of officers who had just realized the last safe route through the glass spine was disintegrating, while 2 million civilians were still inside it. The tactical projection above the chamber did not flicker or distort. It simply became crueler. Blue markers that should have been moving in ordered streams toward the outbound gates slowed, tangled, and began to blink amber one after another as collision warnings multiplied across the convoy lanes. Beyond them, the silver lattice of the spine glowed like a cracked bone in the dark. And behind that fracture, vast and patient, the Naharic Index continued its advance in the same measured geometry that had swallowed 21 systems without ever once needing to hurry. Their ships did not surge. They did not posture. They only adjusted, as if defeat had already been calculated and the rest was administrative. Cell had spent 6 years watching worlds die beneath that logic. She had watched admirals improvise brilliance and lose anyway. She had watched alliances fracture exactly where the Index predicted they would fracture, watched brave captains hold their lines until the moment's survival outweighed duty, and then break in the same pattern every other species broke. The enemy did not merely destroy fleets. It priced fear correctly. That was why everyone in the chamber went still when the new contact appeared, not from the enemy front, not from the collapsing gates, but from dead space above the refugee stream where no ship should have been able to translate at all. It arrived without fanfare, without escort, without a fleet shadow behind it. One vessel, long, dark, and strangely unthreatening at first glance, like a machine built to endure disaster rather than cause it. It rolled out of distortion and held position above the dying corridor, while half the room stared in disbelief and the other half reached instinctively for identification grids that were already filling themselves in. Human origin, Earth registry, independent emergency authority, vessel designation, Lantern Meridian. Cell felt the silence before anyone spoke, and in that silence came the insult all over again. This was what Earth had sent, not the Armada the Coalition had begged for across 3 separate appeals, not the promised reserve fleets everyone whispered humanity must have hidden somewhere beyond mapped space. One ship, entering a collapse zone, so late it bordered on mockery. Then the channel opened, and the woman on the screen did not ask for tactical command, battle projections, or enemy tonnage. She looked to be in her 50s by human measure, broad-shouldered, calm, and so utterly unhurried that the chaos behind Cell suddenly felt louder by comparison. Firelight moved across the human commander's face from somewhere off-screen, but her voice remained level, almost annoyingly level, as if she had entered a storm she already understood. "How many children are still in transit?" she asked. "What is the live mass of the convoy, and who currently controls the evacuation clock?" Nobody in the chamber answered at first, because none of those were the questions a warship asked. And then, for light minutes away, the Naharic Index halted its forward batteries in perfect, impossible unison. No one in the chamber moved until the human asked the question a second time, and somehow that made it worse. She did not raise her voice. She did not repeat herself, with impatience or ceremony. She only stood there in the center of the transmission, one hand resting against the edge of a console lit by amber emergency strips, and waited with the composure of someone who had arrived expecting panic and found nothing surprising in it. Around Cell, Officers were still trying to understand why the Nharak forward batteries had gone cold. The enemy had not withdrawn. Its formation still spanned the shattered dark beyond the glass spine in those same clean, almost elegant bands of pressure that had strangled half the frontier. Yet the firing solution that should have carved through the trapped refugee lanes had simply paused. Cell forced herself to answer first, because everyone else was staring at the tactical display as though it might explain itself if they looked hard enough. "Approximately 400,000 miners remain in transit," she said, hating how dry her mouth sounded. "Live convoy mass is still updating. The evacuation clock is under Coalition Emergency Authority." The human nodded once. "Transfer it." The nearest admiral gave a short, incredulous laugh that had no humor in it at all. Admiral Turin Sol, master of the Spine Defense Array and veteran of the Keled Retreat, stepped forward with the rigid fury of a man who had not slept in 2 days and was finally being offered something to direct that fury toward. "Absolutely not," he said. "You arrive late, alone, and without the fleet requested, and your first act is to demand control of our evacuation?" The human studied him for a moment, not with offense, not even with challenge, but with a brief, measuring patience that Cell found unexpectedly unnerving. "My first act," she said, "was arriving where your fleet geometry says survival is no longer statistically supportable. My second act is keeping your civilians from dying while you decide whether you want help badly enough to stop being territorial." She glanced past him, directly at Cell again. "Minister, transfer the clock." There were a dozen reasons not to do it. Cell knew all of them intimately. Protocol, chain of command, political consequence, historical insult. Humanity had sat out the first years of the war while worlds burned in equations the Nharak Index solved faster than any coalition species could adapt to them. Every plea sent to Earth had come back with the same polished sympathy and the same infuriating distance. Support packages, corridor relief, medical shares, observers, never ships, never commitment, never the answer that mattered. And now, at the exact hour when the spine was cracking and every rescue model said the convoy would fragment before the next gate cycle, Earth had sent one vessel and a woman who spoke like she had already been obeyed. Cell transferred the clock. The chamber erupted on 3 channels at once. INs, legal warnings, military protests, demands for override. She shut them all out as the control lattice rotated above the table and the Lantern Meridian's authorization codes folded seamlessly into the evacuation grid with a priority depth no coalition member should have possessed. That, more than the human commander's tone, changed the temperature in the room. Someone at Earth had prepared for this. Not generally, not symbolically, specifically. "My name is Mara Vale," the human said, as if introductions still mattered after that. "I am acting command authority for the Meridian under Terran Catastrophic Response Doctrine." The title meant nothing to most of the room, which was obvious from the silence that followed. From this point forward, all warships in the corridor will stop thinking of themselves as combat assets and begin thinking of themselves as moving infrastructure. You are not here to engage the Index. You are here to hold lanes, shield mass, and obey timing. Admiral Sol stared at her in outright disbelief. "Do you have any idea what is approaching us?" "Yes," Vale said. "More importantly, I know what is approaching your civilians. Those are different problems, and you've been solving the wrong one for 6 years." That struck the chamber harder than shouting would have. Cell saw it in the faces around her, the offended stillness of people who had sacrificed too much to be told they had misunderstood the shape of their own disaster. But Vale did not press the insult. She turned slightly, and for the first time the transmission widened enough to show what was happening behind her. The inside of the Meridian did not look like a warship bridge. There were no ceremonial command tiers, no raised tactical thrones, no rows of officers frozen in martial efficiency. Cell saw medics strapping down trauma racks, engineers hauling sealed field modules toward a bay lit in warning red, and an entire wall of civilian rescue telemetry scrolling so fast it blurred. One crewman in a scorched utility harness was manually locking down what looked disturbingly like a nursery support frame. Cell blinked. "That ship," she said before she could stop herself. "What exactly did Earth send us?" Vale's expression did not change, but something colder entered her eyes, something private and very old. "The right tool," she said. "Whether you deserve it is a conversation for later." At the edge of the tactical display, the Nharik formation shifted again, not advancing, recalculating. Their outer arcs moved by degrees, so small most eyes would have missed them. But Cell had spent too long studying those patterns not to feel the threat in tiny changes. The enemy was not confused. Confusion implied disorder. This was something more dangerous. It was adjustment. The index had seen the meridian and chosen not to fire, which meant it had found a reason not to fire, and the existence of a reason frightened Cell more than open attack would have. Vale saw the same movement and began issuing orders with an economy that allowed no room for argument. Civilian clusters were to be compressed into asymmetrical stacks rather than neat convoy ribbons. Damaged freighters previously marked expendable were to be recaptured and dragged into shield overlap. 2 destroyer screens were ordered to rotate broadside and lock thrust, not toward the enemy, but toward the civilians. Every instinct in the chamber rebelled against the geometry of it. It looked wrong, untidy, vulnerable, like panic disguised as strategy. Then a quiet voice from signals broke across the room. "Minister," the officer said, pale and rigid over his console. "The index has transmitted." The chamber froze. For 6 years, the enemy had never opened a direct channel inside an active collapse theater. Their declarations came before conquest or after surrender, never in the middle, never while the outcome was still moving. Cell turned back to the central display as the message unwound in translated glyphs, each line appearing with machine-perfect calm. Coalition Evacuation Authority is mathematically void. Further resistance produces no survivable advantage. Transfer refugee control and preservation terms will be issued. A rustle of horror moved through the room, because the language was wrong in a way only veteran officers would understand. The index was not speaking to the coalition as a defeated force. It was speaking as though something in the corridor had introduced a variable it considered important enough to negotiate around. Cell looked up at Mara Vale, expecting anger, contempt, anything human. Instead, the commander of the Lantern Meridian smiled, like someone who had just been handed the answer to a question she had hoped the enemy would ask. And then she said very softly, "Good. That means they're afraid of the same thing I am." For a moment, nobody in the chamber seemed able to process the fact that a human had just smiled at a live negotiation from the species that had broken half the known frontier. The translated glyphs of the Nharik offer still hung above the tactical table in cool white lines, each one precise, bloodless, and obscene in its certainty. Transfer refugee control. Preservation terms. As if 400,000 children and nearly 3 million terrified civilians were cargo to be reassigned between competent custodians. As if the war itself were already over everywhere that mattered, and only arithmetic remained. Admiral Soul found his voice first. "You think this is fear," he said, turning on Mara Vale with open disbelief. "This is pressure language. They have used variants of it before planetary capitulations." "Not like this," Cell said before she could stop herself. The room turned to her. She hated that it had, hated more that she was sure. 6 years of studying Nharik conquest patterns had carved too many instincts into her bones to deny them now. They do not negotiate inside active collapse windows, she said. Not when the kill curve is already stable. If they speak now, something has destabilized. Her eyes lifted to the display again, or they believe it might. Vale gave the smallest nod, as if Cell had finally stepped onto the edge of the same thought. Exactly. She touched something off-screen, and the human vessel's telemetry layered itself over the main tactical map, with an authority that still felt invasive. The Index is not offering mercy. It is checking whether the corridor remains solvable under its current assumptions. Admiral Soul's anger deepened, because anger was simpler than understanding. You are speaking in riddles while my defense lines are collapsing. No, Vale said. I'm speaking plainly, and that's why it sounds unfamiliar. She expanded the enemy formation with 2 motions of her hand. The Neheric attack geometry unfolded in cold bands. Forward interceptors, compression wings, signal relays, predictive lattice nodes, containment arcs. Beautiful in the way poisonous things could be beautiful. Cell had seen versions of that pattern around shattered moons, dead stations, burning cities. Always the same elegance. Always the same outcome. Yet now Vale highlighted not their weapons, not their heaviest ships, but the spaces between them. The Coalition keeps reading their war doctrine as domination by force. Vale said, that is true, but incomplete. The Index does not win because it hits harder. It wins because every engagement is a pricing event. It calculates how much pressure a species can absorb before self-preservation becomes the rational choice. Then it shapes the battle to arrive at that threshold with minimal waste. Her fingers moved again, and old engagement ghosts bloomed across the table. Coalition retreats, shattered escort formations, evacuation lanes abandoned exactly 1 maneuver too early. You think these are defeats of courage. They are defeats of prediction. Something cold moved through Cell's chest, because once spoken aloud, it made too much sense. Every time they had called a retreat necessary, prudent, mathematically unavoidable, they had also been giving the enemy exactly the answer it expected. They had fought bravely, lost dearly, and remained legible. Vale zoomed in on the trapped refugee stream. Civilian arcs, hospital barges, freight hulks turned into lifeboats, escort screens fraying around them like overstrained thread. The Index knows what warships do. It knows what frightened civilians do. It knows what collapsing alliances do. All of those responses are modaliable, but right now it is hesitating because I have introduced an object it cannot confidently classify. She met Cell's gaze through the screen. Do you know what your people called us in the early membership years? Cell did know, though she wished suddenly that she did not. The patient predators, she said quietly. A few officers in the chamber looked startled. Mara Vale only shrugged, not offended, which somehow made the old name feel truer. Close enough. The Coalition saw a civilization that stayed polite, withheld commitments, and kept building internal logistics far beyond what diplomacy required. You assumed caution. Some of you assumed cowardice. There was no pride in her voice, only the flatness of a fact long settled. The Index saw something else. It saw a species that kept preparing for catastrophes larger than the ones in front of it. It has been watching us do that for centuries. The problem is, it still doesn't know why. Cell stared at the bridge behind Vale again, at the medics, the engineering crews, the trauma racks, the support cradles, the ship that did not look like any war doctrine the Coalition revered. A thought rose in her mind, too strange to speak at first. When she finally did, the words came out thinner than she intended. This vessel was not built for victory, was it? That, for the first time, made Vale pause. Not because she was caught off guard, Cell realized, but because she was deciding how much truth the moment could bear. No, Vale said at last. It was built for continuity. The chamber absorbed that in silence. Admiral Soul scoffed, but there was strain in it now. Continuity of what? Vale's answer came, without hesitation, of people, of function, of mission after structure failure, of choice after the moment when most species stop believing choices still exist. Cell felt the room shift around that sentence. Not toward trust exactly, but toward the first dangerous shape of it. Humanity had not sent a duelist. It had sent something designed to keep meaning intact after the numbers turned impossible. That explained nothing and too much at once. The signals officer broke in again, voice unsteady. "Minister, the Index is updating its offer. They request immediate confirmation of command authority aboard the human vessel." Vale exhaled once through her nose, almost amused. "There it is." Cell looked from the officer back to the human commander. "What does that mean?" "It means," Vale said, "they are trying to determine whether I can be pressured by the same incentives that work on everyone else." Her gaze hardened, and for the first time there was something fierce under the calm, a controlled brightness like heat behind steel. "Do not answer yet." "Why?" "Because the next 3 minutes are the most important 3 minutes your corridor will ever experience." Before Cell could ask what that meant, Vale began issuing new orders so fast the chamber could barely track them. All escort captains were to broadcast civilian manifests on open emergency bands. Every damaged Ark was to declare its living passenger count, not its mechanical status. Hospital barges were to light themselves like beacons. Rescue skiffs previously held in reserve were to attach to the slowest transports, not the easiest ones. When Admiral Soul started to object, Vale cut across him with the kind of force that did not need volume to dominate. "I am changing the battlefield," she said. "Until now, the Index has been engaging a failing military retreat with civilian obstruction. In 40 seconds, it will be staring at something else." "And what exactly is that?" Soul demanded. Vale looked up from her console, and this time even Cell felt the full weight of whatever ancient Terran doctrine stood behind her. "A promise," she said. The chamber might have remained frozen in confusion if the tactical display had not transformed at that exact moment. One by one, across the glass spine, coalition ships obeyed her orders. Civilian counts bloomed into the dark in great luminous strings. Not tonnage, not thrust values, lives, infants, surgical wards, school compartments, cryo chambers, names by the thousands, then tens of thousands, flooding across the corridor until the battlefield stopped looking like a military collapse and started looking like a ledger of everything that could still be saved. And for the first time since the war began, the Naharic formation did something no one in that room had ever seen before. It drifted out of symmetry. The break in symmetry lasted less than 4 seconds, but in a war governed by certainty, for seconds was not a detail. It was a wound. Across the tactical display, the Naharic arcs rippled inward and outward by fractional degrees, their beautiful geometry briefly spoiled by a hesitation no coalition analyst had ever managed to force upon them. For one impossible heartbeat, their formation looked less like a verdict and more like a thought interrupted in the middle. Then the chamber came apart. Half the officers present began speaking at once, some with a kind of shocked triumph, others with immediate alarm at what the drift might mean. Admiral Soul did not celebrate. He understood battlefields too well for that. His eyes narrowed on the display, and Cell could almost feel him searching for the hidden counterstroke. "They are not breaking," he said. "They are re-indexing target priority." Mara Vale did not deny it. "Of course they are." The answer hit the room like cold water. Cell stared at the human commander. "Then what did we gain?" "Time," Vale said, "and a clearer look at how they assign moral weight." No one in the chamber understood what she meant except perhaps Cell, and even she only understood the shape of it, not the machinery underneath. The Naharic Index had always behaved as though lives were units, Fear was velocity, and resistance was merely another pressure curve to solve. But the moment the battlefield had been forced to declare itself in names rather than tonnage, the index had wavered. Not because it cared, Cell suspected, but because it had been forced to recalculate around something humanity clearly considered sacred enough to change tactics for. The next transmission arrived before she could finish the thought. It was not a threat this time. It was a terms packet. The glyphs unfolded in measured white streams over the command table, translating as they came. Coalition military units were ordered to disengage and surrender corridor authority. Civilian populations would be preserved, classified, relocated, and redistributed according to stability requirements. No further large-scale loss of life was necessary, the index assured them, provided resistance ceased within 7 minutes. 7 minutes. It was the most generous deadline the Herrick had ever offered, and that frightened Cell more than open contempt would have. A murmur rolled through the chamber, ugly in its emotional complexity. Not relief. Never relief. But temptation given the language of mercy. Everyone in that room had seen what happened after refusal. They had seen moons gutted for transit minerals, orbital habitats stripped into labor architecture, displaced populations filed into categories from which no old culture ever emerged. Yet they had also seen fleets burned to vapor for insisting on heroic last stands that saved no one. The index was cruel, but it was not theatrical. If it said fewer would die after surrender, that part at least was likely true, which was exactly why several captains on emergency relay began asking whether the offer should be considered. Cell felt the betrayal of that question like heat under her ribs, then hated herself for feeling it. These were not cowards. They were exhausted commanders with refugee compartments full of families and failing shields around them. They were hearing the same phrase the index had weaponized for 6 years. No survivable advantage. Enough repetitions of that phrase, and even defiance began to sound self-indulgent. Admiral Soul slammed a hand against the tactical rail. No one answers that transmission. "We may have to," said Director Halen from Convoy Operations, her voice thin and strained. "If the corridor collapses and the spine goes dark, we lose everyone anyway." "That is exactly the sentence they want you to say," Vale replied. Cell looked up sharply. Mara Vale had not raised her voice, but the calm in it had changed. It had become harder, narrower, less like patience, and more like a blade being turned until the edge faced out. "The index does not need you to believe surrender is noble," she continued. "It only needs you to believe it is reasonable. Once you accept their definition of reasonable, the rest of the battle is clerical." Director Halen bristled. "And what would you call reasonable, Commander? We have millions trapped, a corridor degrading by the minute, and one human vessel sitting in the middle of a miracle we still do not understand." Vale regarded her without any visible offense. "I would call it reasonable," she said, "to stop asking whether you can save everyone by staying safe enough to keep trying later. Later is gone. The corridor has already decided that for you." The words landed with brutal precision because everyone in the room knew they were true. There would be no second evacuation, no clean fallback. The glass spine was not failing in theory. It was failing now, visibly, audibly, catastrophically. Every choice from this point forward would be paid for once and in full. Cell expected the human commander to reject the surrender packet outright, perhaps with the kind of defiant speech coalition history was built on. Instead, Mara Vale did something far worse for the room's nerves. She asked for the full terms to be opened on the primary display. Even Admiral Soul looked genuinely stunned. "You cannot be serious." "Open it," Vale said. The packet expanded above them. Preservation quotas, labor redistribution estimates, environmental suitability tables for resettlement, child separation protocols. disguised under developmental optimization language, so Cold Cell felt her stomach turn. The Narration Index had not sent a peace offer. It had sent a spreadsheet for the digestion of a civilization, and Mara Vale read every line. She read them slowly enough that outrage began to curdle into suspicion. Around the chamber, officers exchanged looks that were no longer merely frightened but offended. Some interpreted her silence as calculation, some as indecency. Admiral Soul did not hide his disgust. "You will not actually entertain this," he said. Vale kept reading. "Commander." Still nothing. Cell felt the chamber shifting toward a dangerous conclusion. For one wild instant, even she wondered if humanity's patience concealed something uglier than caution. Earth had watched the war for years. Earth had prepared for this exact hour. What if the species behind all that patience truly did weigh lives differently? What if the same civilization that built ships for continuity also believed continuity sometimes required surrendering whole populations so the remainder could endure? The thought horrified her precisely because she could not dismiss it immediately. Then Vale spoke, without looking up from the packet. "There," she said. No one answered. She enlarged a section of the transmission and marked a subtle timing discrepancy buried in the handoff architecture of the offer. Then another. Then a third. Tiny inconsistencies in phrasing, latency, and category logic. Meaningless to most eyes, but clearly not meaningless to her. "The index is not offering peace," Vale said. "It is stress testing intent. It wants to know which losses force you to preserve yourself instead of your mission." Her eyes lifted at last, and they were colder than Cell had yet seen them. "More importantly, it wants to know whether I will do the same." Admiral Soul frowned. "And will you?" For the first time since arriving, Mara Vale let the silence linger before answering. Not for drama, Cell realized, but because she was deciding whether the truth would help or damage what came next. "When losses rise," she said at last, "most military doctrines become more self-protective. They retreat, consolidate, trade lives for future probability. The index depends on that turn. It is how they close every war." She glanced back to the surrender packet, but they are uncertain now because human catastrophic doctrine does something different. In certain missions, rising losses do not make us pull back. She paused. They make us commit harder. No one in the room spoke. On the display, the Narration formation began to move again, not forward in conquest geometry this time, but sideways, subtle, surgical, like a mind reaching toward the convoy's weakest flank with a new question. And then every civilian alarm across the glass spine lit at once. The alarms did not announce incoming fire. That was what made them so much worse. Every board in the chamber flared with the same deep amber pulse used for civilian breach events, life support instability, and compartment separation inside refugee traffic. Across the spine, the Narration formation had not lunged for the warships or tightened around the coalition screens. It had reached sideways, just as Mara Vale had predicted, and touched the slowest edge of the convoy where overloaded shelter barges, hospital cradles, and improvised child transports were struggling to maintain formation through the fractured corridor. The enemy had changed the question. It was no longer asking how much pain the coalition fleet could absorb. It was asking what the humans would do when saving everyone became physically untidy. Cell saw the pattern unfold in a rush that made her throat tighten. The weakest civilian clusters were being isolated without a shot fired. Narration interceptors slid into blocking vectors. Signal pressure rose inside the convoy lanes, and traffic control systems across the spine began choking with false route confirmations and clean-looking detours that led nowhere survivable. It was not an attack meant to break the corridor. It was an attack meant to force triage, save the many and abandon the stranded, protect the center and let the edges die. Preserve the mission by sacrificing the pieces least likely to make it anyway. Every Coalition admiral in the room recognized the shape of that trap because all of them, at some point in this war, had accepted it as the only rational answer. Mara Vale did not even look surprised. "Now," she said, and the word dropped into the chamber with the weight of something prepared long before arrival. On the tactical display, the Lantern Meridian moved for the first time in a way Cell could feel rather than merely track. The vessel broke from its holding posture above the collapsing corridor and descended straight into the civilian stream, not toward the safest central lane, but toward the crippled outer clusters the Nharak had marked for separation. The Admiralty screens immediately flooded with warnings: collision risk, corridor instability, shield overlap violation. Cell expected Vale to correct course, to arc gracefully through the traffic, to preserve what maneuver margin remained. Instead, the human ship opened, not with weapons, not with launch bays or missile cells or hidden gun spines unfolding from the hull. The black flanks of the Meridian split along lines so smooth Cell had not known they were seams at all, and from within them came structures no Coalition war architect would ever have designed into a combat vessel. Massive articulated rescue arms flowered into the dark. Tow lances extended on telescoping rails. Brace lattices uncoiled like skeletal bridges. Shield vanes widened, not to narrow into a striking profile, but to broaden until the ship's silhouette became absurdly, gloriously unwarlike. It did not resemble a predator unveiling its teeth. It resembled a city revealing the machinery it had hidden for the day the earthquake finally arrived. The chamber went silent for the second time that day. Cell understood it before anyone explained it, though understanding only made the awe hit harder. The Lantern Meridian had never been meant to win a duel. It had been built to catch failure in mid-collapse and force it to keep functioning anyway. Vale's voice moved through the chamber like current through a live wire. All Coalition escorts are to anchor on my mark. Destroyers shift broadside and match my drift. Civilian convoy status is no longer discretionary. If it floats, bleeds, breathes, or still contains power, it belongs to the lane. I want every abandoned hull reclassified as usable mass. Admiral Soul stared at the expanding geometry around the Meridian. "You are turning the convoy into a formation." "No," Vale said. "I'm turning it into an organism." The ship reached the outer civilian clusters, just as the Nharak interceptors began tightening the choke. Cell expected violence, but what erupted from the Meridian was stranger, and in some ways more terrifying. Rescue drones flooded from hidden recesses in blinding swarms, not sleek attack shapes, but brutal, workmanlike machines wrapped in manipulator arms, foam projectors, breech collars, and tow couplings. They slammed into damaged arcs, bonded themselves to torn hulls, and fired sealant webs across fractured seams. Brace spines locked one failing transport to another, then to a drifting fuel carrier, then to a broken escort, building ugly, improvised continuity where the convoy had been unraveling minutes earlier. One hospital cradle lost thrust and began to yaw out of line. The Meridian hit it with a gravitic tow lance and dragged 3 adjacent refugee barges with it, pulling all 4 back into shield shadow as if rethreading a snapped necklace in the middle of a firefight. The Nharak reacted at once. Their interceptors cut inward, seeking to puncture the new structure before it stabilized. That was when the Meridian's true cruelty revealed itself. Not cruelty toward the refugees, but toward the logic of the battlefield. Every civilian ship it linked ceased being a passive liability and became part of a single moving rescue architecture the Index had never modeled. Each hulk added mass. Each damaged barge added cover. Each medical transport added motive force or shield geometry or life sign priority that altered how the Coalition escorts were forced to position themselves. The refugees were no longer clutter, obstructing warships. They were the center of the design. Cell felt the realization move through the room in staggered waves. The human commander had not arrived to escort the convoy through danger. She had arrived to make the convoy itself harder to kill than the fleet around it. A Naharic Lance battery finally opened fire, perhaps deciding the experiment had gone far enough. The shot should have cleaved through 3 linked shelter barges and a medical pod line. Instead, the Meridian rotated between them, and the beam struck the human ship broadside. The impact blinded half the chamber, displays white. Heat spikes tore through the telemetry feed. Warning bands cascaded across the ship's outer lattice as one entire section of rescue framework went molten and sheared away into the corridor. Cell heard someone curse. Someone else started to say the ship was crippled. Then the Meridian drove deeper into the lane. Not back, toward the intact center. Not upward into clean maneuver space. Deeper, into the unstable, overloaded, half-broken section the Naharic had selected precisely because no sane command would commit there after taking a hit like that. Admiral Soul went pale in a way Cell had not thought possible for him. "She's protecting the worst section," he said. Vale answered without drama. "Of course I am. You just lost a third of your outer rescue frame." "I know. And you are moving closer to the pressure point." "Yes." He turned toward the central screen, as if perhaps proximity would make the insanity less obvious. "Why?" Mara Vale looked directly at him, and for the first time there was no distance at all in her voice, no professional coolness, no effort to soften what humanity was about to reveal. "Because the Naharic still think this battle is about preserving the most survivable assets," she said. "I need them to understand something about our species before they lock the next prediction." Outside, the Meridian took hold of a drifting line of child transports and pulled them bodily into the heart of its expanding lattice, while more fire converged on its widening silhouette. The convoy, the fleet, the chamber, the entire corridor seemed to lean toward that one impossible black ship, as if the gravity of its intention were changing everything around it. Then Vale gave the order that made Cell's blood run cold. "Open the ARC protocols," she said. "All of them." The ARC protocols changed the meaning of the corridor in less than 30 seconds. Across every coalition channel, new command architecture erupted out of the Lantern Meridian and overlaid itself on the evacuation grid with the terrifying precision of something built for disasters, so complete they had once been treated as civilization-ending thought experiments. Civilian lanes ceased being suggestions and became hard-priority mission arteries. Damaged hulls, previously marked non-recoverable, were reassigned as buoyant shielding masts. Rescue drones stopped asking permission before cutting through sealed compartments, if doing so increased extraction flow by even fractional margins. Medical frigates were pulled into the convoy's spine and wrapped in escort geometry, so dense it made several admirals openly protest. The Meridian itself became the beating center of it all, its burned outer frame shedding molten debris into the dark, while its surviving rescue lattice expanded wider, uglier, and more magnificent with every passing minute. And the Naharic Index adapted. Cell watched it happen with the cold nausea of a veteran observer, seeing an enemy recover from the impossible faster than hope could settle into confidence. The interceptors withdrew from the central pressure line and redistributed outward in razor-thin vectors toward the convoy's slowest civilian clusters. Not the most valuable by mass, not the most politically important, the slowest, the least maneuverable, the ones that forced everything around them to either protect them or move past them. The Index had abandoned the older question of whether the coalition would retreat. It was now solving a newer, sharper one: whether humans would preserve the majority by letting the most difficult lives fall behind. The answer arrived from the Meridian in thrust burn and welded steel. Human tow rigs slammed into a drifting agricultural ark whose engines had gone intermittent 3 minutes earlier. A burned-out school transport with 800 children in shock harnesses was dragged bodily into a shielded pocket between two destroyers that had been ordered to present themselves as armor rather than weapons. A half-shattered hospital ring, venting atmosphere in a slow silver plume, was stitched to 3 freighter husks and pushed forward under a canopy of drones, projecting temporary pressure foam over wounds too large for any sane engineer to call reparable. Everywhere Cell looked, humanity was performing acts that Coalition doctrine would have labeled wasteful, inefficient, emotionally compromised. And everywhere she looked, those same acts were converting collapse into motion. Admiral Soul had stopped arguing and started learning, which Cell suspected was harder for him than combat had ever been. He stood rigid over the tactical rail, tracking the new geometry with the expression of a man watching a sacred law of war being broken in front of him and discovering that the law had perhaps never been sacred to begin with. "They are stretching you," he said over the command net. "They know you cannot carry every crippled hull and maintain corridor speed. They are not trying to destroy the convoy anymore. They are trying to make you choose." On the central display, Mara Vale did not even glance up from her command overlays. "Yes," she said, "that is the entire war." Cell felt that sentence land in places much older than the current battle. For 6 years, the Coalition had believed the war was about space, ships, numbers, choke points, attrition schedules, industrial endurance. But what if all of that had only ever been scaffolding around the real conflict? A species that priced survival against duty had encountered one that, under certain conditions, simply stopped running that math. Everything else followed from there. Then Herrick pressed harder. 2 shelter chains on the convoy's outer starboard edge lost thrust within seconds of each other after precision strikes clipped their maneuver spines. Not lethal hits, deliberate inconveniences. The sort of damage designed to create drag, not death, because drag would do the enemy's work more elegantly than annihilation. The nearest Coalition escorts turned instinctively toward the healthier core lanes, calculating overall preservation. The Meridian overrode them before their engines completed the pivot. "Negative," Vale said, and there was iron in the word now. "Nobody peels. Nobody optimizes around the center. Lock tow and bring the starboard chains under my shadow." A captain from the 7th Fringe group actually shouted over the relay, his voice cracking under the strain of watching his own ships get dragged into what every prior battle instinct told him was a fatal error. "Commander, that section will collapse our forward rate. If we hold for them, we lose the corridor." Vale's hands kept moving. "If we leave them, we lose the mission." "That is not the same thing." At that, she finally looked up, and even through 3 layers of transmission compression cell, could see that the human commander had crossed some internal threshold. She did not look angry. Anger would have been smaller. She looked like a woman speaking from somewhere deeper than emotion, from a place inside the species behind her that had been used before and would be used again as often as history demanded. "No," Mara Vale said. "It is exactly the same thing. That is what the Index still does not understand." Another hit struck the Meridian, this one along the aft rescue spine, where dozens of drones were cycling in and out with wounded and salvage modules. The telemetry alarms came in red sheets. Structural stress, power bleed, heat cascade. One entire section of articulated support lattice locked half-extended and tore away under acceleration, spinning out through the convoy like the broken rib of some giant black animal. Cell heard gasps in the chamber as the damage estimate populated. The Meridian still had the power to save most of the convoy, possibly even the vast majority, but all at once it seemed obvious that saving all of it was no longer a question of bravery. It was a question of whether humanity was willing to become unreasonable beyond any doctrinal meaning the Coalition recognized. Cell keyed a direct line to Vale before she had fully decided to speak. "Commander," she said, and hated how personal the word sounded, "what happens when you can no longer hold everyone?" The silence that followed was short, but not empty. On the human bridge behind Vale, Cell saw exhausted crew moving with scorched sleeves and burned hands, saw a medic being patched at one station, while continuing to route casualty triage with the other hand, saw an engineer physically brace a shaking console against vibration while reading off field integrity values. None of them looked panicked. None of them even looked surprised. They looked like people working inside an answer they had accepted long before the question arrived. "There is a list," Vale said at last. The chamber went still. She enlarged a hidden file on the tactical grid, and a ranked matrix appeared in one corner of the projection. Convoy sections, tow probabilities, shield allocation forecasts, survival efficiencies, corridor loss projections. It was clinical, ruthless, horrifying in its necessity. Cell stared at the sequence and felt sick because she understood it instantly. Before entering the spine, Mara Vale had already decided which ships could be saved first if everything failed, which groups would have to be cut loose if the physics turned against them hard enough, and how deep into the impossible she would go before preserving some fraction of life became the only remaining form of honesty. Admiral Soul spoke for the room, though his voice had lost all accusation. "You planned the order of abandonment." Vale did not flinch. "I planned against lying to myself under pressure." The truth of that hit Cell harder than any speech about courage could have. Hope, she realized, was cheap when it demanded no accounting. Humanity's terrifying difference was not that it refused to see the cost. It was that it looked directly at the cost, named it, ranked it, prepared for it with merciless clarity, and then, when the moment came, still found room to go further than the list had allowed. Because even as Cell stared at the matrix, one thing on it was already wrong. The starboard shelter chains the Index had crippled were flagged as non-recoverable beyond a certain pressure threshold. Yet on the live display, the Meridian was dragging them anyway, reshaping the entire convoy around lives the plan had once accepted as mathematically lost. Vale saw Cell notice. For the first time since her arrival, the human commander's face showed something that might have been weariness or grief, or simply the unbearable weight of a species that kept choosing this for itself. "The list was correct when I made it," she said softly. "The mission isn't the same mission anymore." Cell felt her breath catch. "What changed?" Vale's answer came while the Meridian rolled into fresh fire to shield those same marked-for-loss vessels, and every crew member on her bridge continued working as if no order in the universe could have persuaded them to do otherwise. "We took lock on them," she said. "Now they're ours." Then every exit model on the glass spine abruptly collapsed to black. For half a second, the disappearance of the exit models looked like a system failure. The route lattice over the glass spine went dark, the projected geometry that had been updating by the breathless microsecond simply vanishing from the command table as though someone had cut a vein and all predictive life had drained out of it. Then the fallback alarms hit, deep and continuous, and every officer in the chamber understood the same thing at once. It was not a software collapse, it was a physical one. The final outbound geometry ahead of the convoy, the only clean, survivable path left through the spine's dying transfer field, had just been ruined. Cell felt the floor move under her feet, though the station remained steady. All around her, commanders were shouting for confirmation from gate monitors, field arrays, outer sensors, relay buoys. The answers came back broken and overlapping, but they resolved into one unbearable truth. The Narration Index had not merely pressed the convoy into a slower, bloodier choice. It had reached ahead and crippled the exit structure itself, folding gravitational noise and lattice disruption into the corridor, so that every route model collapsed into unresolved turbulence. Even if the meridians somehow held the convoy together, there was now nowhere coherent to take it. Admiral Soul's face hardened into that terrible expression seasoned soldiers wore when hope stopped being tactical and became emotional residue. "They closed the throat," he said. "They want us trapped inside the kill box." "No," Mara Vale replied, and though her ship was burning in 7 places and half her rescue skeleton had been torn away, her voice still carried that same unnerving steadiness. "They want us to believe the throat is the mission." Cell turned toward the main display. The Lantern Meridian looked less like a vessel now than a moving catastrophe that had decided not to die. Whole sections of its outer frame were gone. Rescue struts dangled half-severed, still trying to lock onto crippled civilian hulls through fire and debris. One flank of its shield geometry was visibly unstable, phasing in ragged pulses as the ship dragged shelter chains, medical cradles, and broken freighters deeper into the corridor under a storm of pressure the Coalition's finest warships would never have survived for this long. And still it kept moving, not like a machine hoping to escape, but like something committed to finishing a sentence, no matter how much of the page had to burn away around it. The Nharak had seen that too. Their formation was no longer elegant. It was aggressive in a way that bordered on desperate, bending around the convoy in converging layers meant to box the refugee mass against the dead exit geometry. They were no longer trying to calculate how to force a retreat. They were trying to force a definition. Partial rescue or total loss, rational surrender or catastrophic defiance. Somewhere inside that living machine intelligence, Cell realized the enemy had finally reached a place it did not know how to price. That should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like standing on the lip of an abyss and hearing the abyss ask what exactly one species was willing to pay for another. Across the command net, Coalition captains began breaking. Not all of them, not even most, but enough to make the danger real. One cruiser group requested permission to detach with the fastest refugee carriers and attempt a narrow independent burn through the turbulence before it worsened. A destroyer captain proposed abandoning the deadweight hospital ring and using its remaining shield output to thicken the central lane for those who could still accelerate. A carrier master, voice raw with strain, argued that preserving 60% of the convoy was better than losing all of it to a human standard no one else had agreed to. Cell heard the truth in every one of those appeals, which made them more dangerous than cowardice ever could have been. There was a logic to each proposal, a grim, defensible logic, the kind that had carried the Coalition through 6 years of losing without fully collapsing, the kind that had also taught the Nharak Index exactly how to shepherd entire civilizations toward surrender one reasonable decision at a time. Mara Vale did not answer them immediately. She was looking at something else. The main tactical display shifted under her control. The dead exit geometry ahead faded, and in its place appeared an older map of the spine's internal mass lanes, construction scars, maintenance cavities, dormant transfer channels, raw field stresses from before the corridor had been formalized into clean traffic architecture. Cell frowned, then went cold. Vale was not looking for the route the Coalition had been trying to save. She was looking at the corridor underneath the corridor, the ugly, unstable, half-forgotten skeleton on which the official evacuation path had once been built. Admiral Soul saw it too. "That's not navigable," he said. "It wasn't meant to be," Vale answered. "It will shear the convoy apart." "It will shear a convoy apart," she said. "Not a structure." Cell felt the pieces begin to align and hated how much sense they made. The Meridian had never been trying to escort discrete ships through a dying route. It had been welding those ships by shield, tow, geometry, and timing into something that functioned less like a convoy and more like a single distributed body. Not because that was elegant, because only something that moved like one organism could survive a passage through space broken enough to reject individual solutions. But even that required time, and the Narration were closing that time down with predatory precision. Their outer layers were sealing around the convoy's flanks, while inner vectors aligned toward the raw maintenance channel Vale had just exposed, as if the enemy had already grasped the new threat and was moving to smother it before it could become real. One more hard strike hit the meridian amidships. The central screen flared white, then resolved into damaged telemetry, so vicious several officers in the chamber went silent mid-sentence. One of the ship's internal rings had depressurized. Power dropped across the rescue lattice. 200 drones blinked out. The vessel staggered in the corridor, not visibly to the naked eye, but in the data. Tiny loss of alignment, a brief falter in tow synchronization, enough for 3 linked refugee hulls to drift wide before emergency couplings slammed them back into place. Cell realized, with a kind of sharpened horror, that this was it. There would be no last reserve, no hidden second human ship, no fleet dropping out of nowhere to turn awe into safety. The Lantern Meridian was not secretly invincible. Humanity had simply sent something that accepted damage more honestly than anyone else in the corridor did, and it was reaching its limit. "Commander," Cell said, opening a direct line, not because protocol allowed it, but because there was no meaningful protocol left. "If you attempt that channel and fail, what happens?" Vale answered without looking at her. "The convoy fragments. The Narration close. Everyone still under. My lock dies slower than I promised." The chamber heard it through Cell's open line, and there was a stunned stillness after it. Not because the answer was cruel, but because it was exact. No false hope, no heroic distortion, just the weight of the choice laid bare in full. Admiral Soul drew a breath through clenched teeth. "Then we cannot attempt it." Mara Vale turned toward the screen at last, and for the first time all day there was visible strain on her face. Not uncertainty, something worse. The cost of carrying certainty when everyone around you still hoped it might be negotiable. "If we don't attempt it," she said, "the Index wins by teaching your captains that the right number of trapped civilians can still force you to redefine the mission downward. If that lesson holds, this war will never end. You'll just keep surviving it in smaller pieces." No one answered, because that was the real threshold now. Not the corridor, not the dying gate, not even the damaged ship at the center of everything. The threshold was whether the Coalition would finally accept the human premise that some missions stopped being percentages and became absolutes, even when the math grew monstrous around them. Cell looked around the chamber and saw the moment in every face. Exhaustion, fear, rage, love disguised as duty, species-old instincts clawing toward preservation. The entire Coalition balanced on the edge of becoming legible to the enemy once again. And somehow, absurdly, the choice had come to her. Not to the admirals, not to Earth, to the minister who had spent 6 years managing loss and calling it responsibility. "Route command," Cell said, and her own voice sounded distant in her ears. "Put the human channel on full relay." Admiral Soul turned to her in disbelief. "Minister." She cut across him, eyes still on the tactical display where the Meridian bled fire into the dark while holding together lives no doctrine should have tried to hold. "You asked me once," she said to Vale, "who controlled the evacuation clock." Her hands were trembling now, but the tremor did not reach her voice. "I do." Mara Vale said nothing. Cell inhaled once, tasted smoke and metal through station filtration, and made the only decision that felt more terrible than surrender. "All Coalition vessels," she said. "Full commit. No separation. No selective withdrawal. We hold human lock to the last viable thrust." She paused, And in that pause the entire chamber seemed to understand that whatever came next would divide history into before and after. "Commander Vale," she said, "show me the way you plan to survive something like this." And on the bridge of the dying Lantern Meridian, the human finally opened the sealed file marked Meridian Endgame. The sealed file did not contain a weapon profile, a miracle engine, or the kind of hidden reserve every frightened imagination in the chamber had been begging the universe to reveal. It contained math, old, brutal, unfriendly math drawn over a structural map of the glass spine's buried maintenance veins, its abandoned transfer cavities, and the half-forgotten load paths that still existed beneath the official corridor, like fossil bones under living flesh. Cell understood the idea in a single, devastating flash. Mara Vale had never intended to force the convoy through the route the Coalition had been trying to preserve. She had intended to turn the convoy itself into the route. The Meridian Endgame propagated across every Allied bridge. Tolok priorities changed. Shield harmonics shifted. Rescue drones were reassigned from patchwork stabilization to permanent structural binding. The linked refugee mass that had seemed so chaotic from outside suddenly resolved into a shape with intention behind it. Freight hulls became compression braces. Destroyers rolled and locked along the outer flanks as ablative ribs. Hospital rings nested into shield pockets at the protected center. Broken shelter barges that would once have been abandoned as dead weight were slotted into load-bearing corridors because their bulk still mattered, their mass still had purpose, their people still counted. Under human command, nothing was reduced to debris while it remained capable of carrying even one more life forward. The Narration Index understood the danger almost immediately. Their inner vectors snapped toward the newly exposed maintenance channel, converging in bands of clean murder meant to collapse the passage before the human-built organism could enter it. Across the tactical table, red geometry flooded the approach. Under any previous doctrine, the answer would have been obvious. Reduce the structure, lighten the convoy, save what could still be saved. Mara Vale did the opposite. She widened the lock. More ships, more hulls, more wounded mass dragged under the same promise. Admiral Soul stared at the numbers and whispered, not to anyone in particular, "She is making the target too morally expensive to divide." Cell heard it and felt the final piece click into place. The Narration Index had spent 6 years winning by forcing every species to separate value from burden, mission from compassion, survival from principle. Humanity's answer was monstrous in its simplicity. Refuse the separation. Bind the burden to the mission so completely that any attempt to optimize one at the expense of the other breaks the whole equation. The Lantern Meridian ignited first, not with a forward charge, not with a desperate sprint toward escape, but with a controlled collapse of its own dying core into a temporary field anchor that punched raw coherence into the maintenance vein ahead. The wounded black ship drove itself into the mouth of the broken channel and opened every surviving rescue spine like the fingers of a hand forcing space itself wider. The impact tore more armor off its frame. Entire sections of outer lattice vaporized, yet the path held, narrow and screaming with instability, and the convoy turn structure moved because there was no longer any difference between the first ship and the last. They were one body now, one impossible, human-shaped refusal. The Narration fired. They fired with all the cold intelligence that had buried worlds and humbled empires, and for the first time in the war it was not enough. Beams that would have broken a fleet were swallowed by layered hull sacrifice and shield nesting. Interceptor strikes that should have severed the convoy found themselves striking freighters braced behind destroyers, rescue foam hardening across the wreckage, fast enough to preserve continuity for 3 more seconds, then 6, then enough. Every fraction of time the index bought with violence. Humanity stole back with commitment. A school transport lost propulsion. and should have fallen out of structure. 2 Allied escorts locked onto it without being ordered and took the drag together. A hospital cradle vented atmosphere into the channel and drifted half-free. Meridian drones welded it to a cargo spine, while medics inside kept operating under red light and falling pressure. One by one, Coalition ships stopped asking how much of the convoy could be preserved and began behaving as if the answer had already been decided for them. Cell watched the shift sweep outward like dawn breaking through a battlefield. Captains who would once have peeled away early held lock until their engines screamed. Gunners who had spent years protecting only viable assets rotated their ships to cover the slow and the damaged. Species that had learned the Naharic lesson of rational surrender too well were now, under unbearable pressure, learning something else from humanity, that there existed a point beyond strategy where duty stopped being a calculation and became identity. At the center of it all, the Meridian continued to die with astonishing purpose. Its internal compartments were venting. Half its drones were gone. One entire flank no longer existed in any meaningful naval sense, only as incandescent wreckage, still somehow carrying field load, because human engineers refused to let broken things stop working until physics physically tore them apart. Mara Vale remained on command relay throughout it, voice steady even as the bridge behind her darkened section by section. She never spoke of sacrifice. She never asked anyone to remember what Earth was doing here. She only gave timings, angles, mass corrections, and once, very quietly, a command to a distant destroyer captain whose ship had begun to slip. "Hold 10 more seconds," she said. "There are children behind you." The captain held for 14. The channel spat fire and metal for what felt like an age, and was, by the clocks, less than 5 minutes. Then the first shelter chain broke through into clear exit space. Then the hospital rings. Then the freighter spine. Then the escorts wrapped around them like exhausted guardians, crossing the threshold into a universe they had not truly believed they would see again. The organism passed. The corridor behind it began to fold in on itself, and the Naharic Index, faced at last with a species that had not merely resisted, but had made resistance impossible to price correctly, did something even more astonishing than its first hesitation. It disengaged, not chaotically, not in fear, in uncertainty. Its outer formations withdrew from the mouth of the maintenance vein and held at a distance no doctrine had ever recorded them choosing under advantage. The remaining pursuit vectors blinked out one by one. Across the emergency bands, a transmission request went out not to the Coalition Command, not to the surviving admirals, but directly to the Lantern Meridian. By the time Cell reached the relay, Mara Vale's ship was barely more than a held-together ruin drifting just inside safe space, its black hull burned white at the edges, its rescue arms frozen where they had locked the convoy through the passage. The human commander appeared on screen through failing light, jacket scorched, one side of her face cut and dark with dried blood. Behind her, crew were still working. Of course they were. The translated Naharic message came through in layered machine comm. "We have revised the projection. Continuation against Terran commitment profile yields unsupportable outcomes. Clarify scale of further Terran intervention." Cell turned to Vale, because suddenly the whole future of the war seemed to hinge on whether humanity answered as saviors, allies, or something far more terrifying. Mara Vale looked at the message, then at the thousands of damaged civilian ships still alive, because one human vessel had refused to redefine the mission downward. When she finally spoke, her voice held no triumph at all, only the quiet certainty of a species that had known this about itself for a very long time. "That," she said, "depends on whether you make us come back." And somewhere across the dark, for the first time in 6 years, the enemy had no correct answer.